we began to see in Canada the same way we saw in London and New York and elsewhere in the West, mass protests. Some of the protests were about, we've talked about this, ad nauseum, about Palestinians, about occupation, about war. A lot of the protests and a lot of the people who drove the core activists who drove a lot of the protests and organized them were much, much more radical, much more concerned about Jewish community, much more committed to a kind of vision of anti-Zionism that would see Israel eradicated and see every Jew who might support Israel simply because it's half the Jews be shamed and excluded from society for that feeling, for the feeling of belonging to that larger Jewish community. All of that happened all at once. What was October 7 like in Canada? And can you maybe compare and contrast to what it would have been like in the United States or London, as much as you're aware? But what did it feel like to be Canadian on October 7? And I'm not talking about the Jewish response to what's happening to the Jews in Israel. I mean, in Canada, among Canadians. What was that experience?
Well, I mean, this ties in very well to what we've been discussing in terms of numbers and influence and cultural output and, our presence in the country relative to what we see in the United States. The experience for Jews, Haviv, in Canada, and I think this could be said, but potentially to a lesser extent in the United States, the experience was really one characterized by a combination of horror, profound isolation and loneliness, and a profound sense of betrayal. Because the reaction outside of the Jewish community ranged from everything from, nuanced characterizations of the mass rape, murder, and kidnapping of Jews as something that should be contextualized as just sort of a natural outgrowth or reaction to the, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it went from everything from being, well, this is just another sort of flare-up to outright celebrations. And we saw this with protests, quote-unquote pro-Palestinian protests, which really gave off very serious pre-pogrom vibes in cities like Ottawa and Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal. I mean, we're talking about people taking to the streets on October 7th. So it was really a spectrum of almost justifying it in a very highbrow sort of way in universities and in the media to just, frankly, barbarically celebrating it. And for the Jew in Canada, probably the most painful period, and it continues to a certain extent to this day, in a generation. But just a combination of shock and horror and real deep loneliness.
One of the things that we've seen, one of the things that I've learned from your writing on this, is that October 7 saw a massive spike of anti-Semitic incidents, some of it genuine, outright brutal violence, a huge amount of it online abuse. And we're not talking about, I fundamentally disagree with the Netanyahu government, or even accusations that the war in Gaza was a war crime or genocide or anything like that. I'm talking about Jews are evil, Jews are a conspiracy to take over the world, how dare the Jews need to be kicked out of Canada. Explicit anti-Semitism that we can't pretend is as something else. All of that spiked massively and never returned to the old baseline. It spiked and it stayed high and it remains high to this day. And there is data on this where 2023 was the first spike, 2024 was higher, 2025 was higher still. That's true in Jewish numbers, Neighborhood Canada numbers. That's true in police numbers. Again, I learned this from, I think you've written about this for the FP. It's not going down. And it's not going down, and Jewish communities are now, actually, you know what, let me read a couple of sentences that you wrote about this and just have you tell us how much this reflects the lived reality of ordinary Canadian Jews. And, we're going to get emails, and I would like to get emails of people tell me this is way too far, it's not that bad, or people telling me this is exactly what I've experienced. You wrote, menorahs are lit in the back of the house, not in the front. On Chanukah, Chanukiot, in other words. Judaica, including necklaces and kippas, are left on nightstands. Mezuzahs are taken down from doorposts. Hebrew is whispered if it is spoken in public at all. Families now routinely skip services at synagogues for fear of violence. A woman recently told me that she has reverted to using her maiden name because it sounds less Jewish, and that friends of hers are doing the same. Casey, is that... It doesn't have to be 100%. I mean, no experienced Jews go through is 100%. 10% of the Jews are part of the anti-Zionist protests, not noticing that they are walking in a line with anti-Semites. Is this the experience of half? Of 40%? Of 80%? Is this the experience of a significant group of Jews in Canada?
This is definitely the experience of a large number of Jews in Canada. I would say of the majority of Jews in Canada. They've been reminded that they're Jews, and because of that, they are retreating inward. And you can feel this. Those examples that I provided in the Free Press, those are real examples. And Haviv, I talk with Jews literally every day across the country, and I speak to audiences in person across the country. I just spoke in my hometown of Halifax last month. But people will stand up in the audience, and they will just let it out. And it's just the emotions are flowing, and you can tell that this has been pent up. There was a nurse who stood up and said, I have to hide my identity at the hospital when I'm working. When people ask me where my accent is from, she's Israeli Canadian, she doesn't tell them. She doesn't let the Star of David slip out of her shirt. People are saying that they don't know what this country is anymore, because it's certainly not the country, and you hear this all the time, Haviv, that, our grandparents helped build and that our mothers and fathers grew up in, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Totally different country today than it was not long ago.
Before we sat down to do this, I looked up hate crime data from Canadian police. Jewish organizations have reported something like 6,800 incidents in 2025, 3 times 2022 levels. That includes, the bulk of it, 90% of it is online, although almost 100 incidents are violent incidents. And as we mentioned, there were 3 shootings at synagogues, targeting synagogues. But one of the interesting things that came up, and the police record many, many less incidents than Jewish organizations. But even in police data, Jews are the most frequently targeted religious group in Canadian hate crime statistics. A lot of these cases, what's really fascinating is, I can't find statistics for who's doing this beyond that they're young and male. In other words, the police in Canada don't record ideology. They don't record ethnicity. They don't record how much of it is coming from Muslim immigrant communities, which is a phenomenally important question. So I can't find in Canadian data where the anti-Semitism is coming from. So I don't even know how much it's about October 7, how much it's about progressive ideologies, how much it's about immigration, how much it's about any of that. Can you enlighten us? Who's doing this unbelievable explosion of anti-Semitic incidents to the point where it's thousands? I mean, a Canadian Jew cannot go online and express themselves as a Canadian Jew without facing anti-Semites. Who's doing it, as far as you can tell?
I'm so glad that you asked this question, and I know many, many people who are going to watch this who are going to go, thank God that he asked that, because this is one of the major issues that the community is feeling today, and one of the issues that is really affecting and polluting the Canadian experience for Jews and non-Jews alike. In Canada, we are intoxicated by a myth. And that myth is that our identity is to accept everyone of all persuasions in their entirety. And all of that diversity is our strength, even if that diversity and those characteristics are completely at odds with our values and the institutions that we've created in Canada. Immigration is good, therefore more immigration is better. And so that's a roundabout way of saying you're asking a question that you almost aren't allowed to ask in Canada because we have destructive levels of tolerance in this country. To answer the question as clearly as I can, Aviv, most of the anti-Semitism in this country, which is really linked to a deep and profound issue that we have here with extremism, with Islamic extremism. I would say Islamism in Canada is probably as bad, if not worse here in Canada than it is in most other Western countries in the world. Most of the anti-Semitism is coming from the Muslim community, as well as this sort of progressive community that you've mentioned. So it's all of them, but all of this is tied to our identity crisis. We don't know who we are as a country. Like I said, we have this real acute sense of suicidal empathy, and people here are petrified to be labeled something. People in Canada are more afraid to be labeled something than they are of what's happening to our country. Because if you talk about these things, you could be labeled bigoted or racist. That's why the issue's not going away, Haviv, because no one feels like they can talk about it. Even our Jewish...
That extends to police data? I'll just be specific about this. The Montreal Synagogue, Beth Tikva firebombing in December 2024. And the same synagogue was attacked just after October 7th. And a young man was arrested, 19 years old, first name Muhammad. Now, in other cases, like the Jewish school shootings in 2024 in Toronto, there were 2 arrests, a 17-year-old and a 20-year-old. I can't find their names. And you might say you'd withhold the name of a minor. Why would you withhold the name of a 20-year-old who shot at a Jewish school? And you go through and the police won't classify, won't give data. Why is immigration status not fundamental to knowing what the heck is happening with crime? Why is this not a policy question? We're going through the major things, right? The synagogue hate crime spree. I mean, the arson, the shootings. There's a 32-year-old man charged in multiple attacks. We don't have names. Police won't release names. And when police do release names, not every media report is willing to run the name. This is a level of suicidal empathy, as you called it. Yeah. Yeah.
And this is a real issue, and people are starting to talk about it more. There's still a great hesitation and fear about, talking about these issues. But really, the matter of it being minors or not, I mean, there are, legalities surrounding, whether or not you can release a minor's name. But I will say this, the fact that we're seeing so many minors involved with these incidents, I mean, Canada's spy agency has come out and talked about the fact that, there is a not insignificant number of minors who are now becoming increasingly involved with extremism and the terrorism related attacks that, have been thwarted here. Thank God. But really, to answer your question, we don't talk about names and ethnicities and religion of the perpetrators of these crimes, because if we did, we would then have to admit that something's wrong, not just with sort of the national ethos of welcome everybody as they are, and we're all just going to be one big happy family, but at the individual level, people who have for decades have considered themselves to be progressive or accepting of everybody or liberal or left-leaning. If they really own this particular issue, which is connected to actually intolerance, terrible public policy, and so on and so forth, they then will find themselves grappling with who they are and what their belief system is. And they will have their own, period of remembrance and potentially retreat. And that is what they were most afraid of. Like I said earlier.
Why maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm Israeli, maybe those are synonyms. Why is it a contradiction to be welcoming of everybody right up until a community arises in your country? It could be centered on a mosque. It could be centered on a church. It could happen to Jews, it could happen to anybody. But wherever it happens, where you have radicalization to the point of mass violence and terrorism, why isn't it part of a policy of welcoming everybody to crack down massively and with clear eyes and clear heads on that kind of a phenomenon? In other words, to me, welcoming everybody is noble. Don't change Canada. But if you have a serious Islamist network radicalizing young people to open fire on schools and you don't crack down on that, you know what that's going to do? That's going to hurt your ability to be open to everybody in the future. This is self-demolishing of the progressive political space. What they're doing to Jews now, they'll learn to do to everybody else. I'm sorry for the stupid question. Why is this hard? Why is this hard? Why can Canadian media not publish the exact names, exact identities, conduct serious investigative journalism, find the mosque where these people are radicalized, or the Twitter feed where these people are, and have a serious conversation about what's going on? Schools are being shot at, synagogues are being shot at. It's not one incident, it's not 3, it's not 5, it's not 10 at this point. When does this become something that Canadian police, Canadian authorities, the Canadian Prime Minister, while he's busy visiting China, actually deals with in a serious way?
Well, I don't think that's a stupid question at all. I think that's a question that millions of Canadians are asking. And they're not finding an answer in that. Not everybody is thinking about these issues in that way. And like I said, while many people are scratching their heads about all this and going, why wasn't the name of the individual released, even though they're not a minor? So we're teaching people, let everybody in, all of them, doesn't matter what they're like. We're tolerant of everybody. Not only are we looking at people who want to come here and deliberately harm us and our allies, and saying, that's fine, come on in as you are, we'll accept you, we're all good, we're not going to make an issue out of any of this. It's not just that we're doing that, we're actually holding the door open for them and saying, come on in. And then at the same time, we're teaching our children, we're teaching this generation of people that the house that you live in, you probably don't deserve to live in. The land that you live on is not your land. It never has been and never will be. And that the sins of your ancestors are your sins too. It's why we play land acknowledgements before the national anthem. How are people supposed to have pride in anything? Why would people be incentivized to fight for something if we're telling them it's not worth fighting for in the first place? So it's all of that. It's the immigration. It's our identity crisis. And it's people, a lot of people, millions of people being afraid to talk about these things because we've taught them that the worst thing in the world that you can be labeled is racist or bigoted or intolerant or Islamophobic. And people are more afraid of that than they are of their grandchildren having to move out of this country for a better place.
But not anti-Semitic. Somehow it didn't fit into that category of things you can't be.
Well, I mean, people here, the average person, I don't think understands anti-Semitism. And now we're getting into this murky area of anti-Zionism. The average person, they don't know about any of these things. And part of that...
Shootings at synagogues, shootings at schools.
I think the attitude is largely, whatever. It's crime. It's this, it's that. It's part of the Arab-Jewish conflict, this enduring conflict. It's an indifference. I think there's some delusion there. I think there's some denial as well. And then there's also just not knowing, and not understanding it. And so it's a combination of things, Haviv, but right now we're left with this really, really toxic environment. And
is there data on anti-Semitism in different communities in Canada? Is it polled? There are Pew polls in the United States that poll blacks and Catholics and Protestants and Hispanics and Muslims, all these different kinds of groups. They subdivide, they section, and we actually can see and learn a great deal. I have had conversations with black friends and black leaders in America even about black anti-Semitism, and they look at these numbers and they say, yeah, problem is there. We're having a conversation about it because the hard data is public. From Pew, from Gallup, you can't run away from it.